Let me be straight with you right now, because something's been eating at me all week and I can't keep sitting on it. This isn't a trade. Nobody tore their ACL. There's no injury report to dissect. But what I stumbled into this week is the kind of story that reveals how this entire league and the media machine surrounding it actually operates when nobody's paying close enough attention. It's one of those things where once you see the pattern, once you really sit down and trace it, you can't go back to watching this stuff the same way. So I'm going to lay it all out, both sides, no shortcuts, and I genuinely believe by the time we're done here, something's going to feel different to you too. Let's start in Cleveland. And I say that because right now, there are two completely separate realities unfolding in that city, playing out on parallel tracks, and the contrast between them is almost surreal when you actually stop to look at both at the same time. Here's the first one. Shedeur Sanders has essentially disappeared from public view this offseason. No press runs, no media tour, no slick social content drip. And here's what gets me. That silence isn't a red flag. It's actually the loudest possible signal. Because when a young quarterback goes dark in the middle of an NFL offseason, there are really only two explanations. Either something's wrong, or he's locked into something so serious that the cameras would only get in the way. Everything we know points to the second one. The fragments that have leaked out didn't come through his camp, didn't come through polished PR machinery. They came secondhand, pieced together, because this guy isn't performing preparation, he's actually doing it. And then actual footage surfaced. Not a staged workout video, not a brand partnership dressed up as a training clip. Raw footage through well-off media showing him working in Colorado at altitude. And I want to stop right there for a second, because I don't think people fully appreciate what that choice actually communicates. Nobody trains at elevation for the content. There's no highlight reel payoff for gasping through thin air with your lungs screaming at you. You don't put yourself through that unless you're chasing something real. Better oxygen efficiency, deeper cardiovascular reserves, the kind of late-game stamina that doesn't show up until the fourth quarter when everyone else starts slowing down, and you're somehow still running clean. That's not a gimmick. That is a calculated, unglamorous investment in future performance, and the fact that he did it without anyone making a big deal about it tells you exactly where his mentality is right now. But here's the layer that's really got me thinking. If you followed Shedeur's development over the past couple of years, his training focus was always consistent with what you'd expect from a refined pocket passer. Drop mechanics, footwork precision, pre-snap reads, the intellectual part of the position, processing information before the snap, manipulating coverages, going through progressions cleanly under pressure. That's always been his foundation, and it's a legitimate one. This offseason, though, he didn't abandon any of that. He stacked something completely new on top of it. Speed development, explosiveness work, movement training that has nothing to do with being a scrambler and everything to do with manufacturing that extra half second when the pocket collapses. And the difference between a completion and a sack is whether you can slide left 3 steps and still deliver on time. And people who've been paying attention, people actually around the building, have started saying something that I think the national conversation completely whiffed on during the draft process. His athleticism was severely underrated coming out, not just a little bit. Badly underrated. There was a version of Shedeur Sanders that the scouting community built in their heads, a clean, controlled, system-dependent pocket guy. And that version was missing an entire dimension that showed up clearly on tape if you were willing to really watch. The escapability, the natural feel for sensing pressure before it arrives, the instinct to slide and reset rather than panic and force the ball. Those aren't things you teach. Either a guy has them or he doesn't. And it turns out he has them. What really hit me though, and I keep coming back to this, is that his own head coach said it caught him off guard. Think about the weight of that admission. This is a coach who came into the building without any development bias, without preconceived narratives. He just watched tape. He looked at the back half of last season with fresh eyes and essentially said out loud, there is more mobility, more escapability, more natural movement here than we anticipated. That's not a hype quote. That's a coach recalibrating his offensive framework around a capability he didn't expect to find. That's an organization quietly shifting its ceiling projection upward based on evidence, not hope. And I'm genuinely frustrated it didn't land with more weight in the national conversation. So that's one screen. A quarterback in relative silence, stacking real weapons onto an already legitimate foundation, while the organization around him is surprised by how much they have to work with. That's the quiet movie, the one without a marketing campaign behind it. Now let me flip the screen, because the second movie is louder, faster, and a whole lot more uncomfortable to sit with, honestly. Brandon Sorsby. And I want to be fair to him personally right from the start, because what I'm about to get into isn't really about him as a person. It's about the machinery around him and what it reveals. Because in a very short window of time, this name went from occupying almost zero space in first-round quarterback conversations to becoming, for a certain segment of the media, an almost obvious first-round selection. And when something moves that fast, without the slow organic buildup of tape study and consensus building, I think you owe it to yourself to ask why. So let me give you the actual football first, because the numbers deserve to be heard without spin. These two quarterbacks played each other directly, same afternoon, same field, same level of competition. The final score wasn't close, somewhere in the neighborhood of 34-20, a decisive margin. And in that game, Shedeur threw for over 300 yards with multiple touchdowns. Sorsby put up roughly 180 yards, a couple of scores, but nowhere near the same weight of performance. Same conference, same opponent quality, one game, one afternoon, and the results told a pretty clear story. Now here's where my jaw dropped a little. One of those two quarterbacks spent the better part of a year getting picked apart by the national media, dissected, questioned, and ultimately drafted in the 5th round. The other one, within what felt like a matter of weeks, became a first-round conversation. And the timing of that flip, right around mid-June, landed in the middle of a moment when the first quarterback was dealing with something genuinely difficult in his personal life. I don't want to throw that word convenient around carelessly, because I think we should be precise about what we're actually observing. I'm not saying there's a room somewhere with people pulling strings. What I am saying is that this guy deserves first-round consideration is a conclusion that's supposed to emerge from months of careful film work, cross-referenced evaluations, source building, and honest comparative analysis. It is not supposed to arrive in a flash, anchored to a specific news cycle, positioned almost directly opposite a specific other player's name. That's not scouting, that's narrative construction. And once you can see the difference between those two things, it's very hard to pretend they're the same. Here's where I have to get really honest with you, and I want to be careful because this is the part that matters most. During Shedeur Sanders' entire pre-draft process, and we're talking about months of continuous, relentless national coverage, the conversation almost never anchored itself to actual football. Rarely did it center on arm talent, anticipation throws, manipulation of safeties, pocket footwork under duress. Those things occasionally got mentioned, but the dominant narrative, it was about his personality, about his father's shadow following him everywhere, about his tone in interviews, his perceived arrogance, his supposed attitude issues. Entire media structures got erected around character questions that, when you pressed on them, didn't have actual foundations. A gambling issue that belonged to someone else entirely got woven into his story. His relationships became tabloid content. 30-second clips from interviews got analyzed frame by frame like they were depositions. And whenever someone pushed back and said, "Hey, can we talk about the actual football here?" the goalposts moved. Quietly, effortlessly, without anyone acknowledging they'd moved at all. Now here's where I need you to hold two things in your head simultaneously, because there's a player in this same conversation with a real, confirmed, documented gambling situation. Serious enough that he had to step completely away from football to address it. Serious enough to require court proceedings just to restore his eligibility to play his final season. And I want to be absolutely clear about something before I go any further. I am not mocking that. Addiction is real. Gambling disorders are serious mental health issues. A young person who recognizes a problem and fights through it deserves support, not ridicule. I mean that without any sarcasm whatsoever. But the gap, that gap is what I can't get past. If completely unverified, never proven, built on nothing character speculation was enough to shadow a player's entire draft journey and ultimately contribute to him falling to the 5th round, then how does a confirmed, documented, serious, real-world issue barely register as a footnote when it involves someone else? How does one become months of relentless narrative and the other becomes a warmly written redemption arc in the span of a few weeks? Either character concerns matter in NFL draft evaluations, or they don't. You can't apply them with surgical precision to one name and then practically dissolve them for another and pretend the difference is just objective scouting. And this is the moment where Colin Cowherd walks into the conversation and almost by accident makes the contradiction visible himself. Look, Cowherd's been a tough critic of young quarterbacks for a long time. He'll tell you that himself. He's talked openly about being wrong on Manziel, about being harsh on early Baker Mayfield, about his discomfort watching Deshaun Watson handle fame as a young player. He's applied a hard lens across the position historically, and there's something almost respectable about that consistency, at least in theory. His criticism of Shedeur ranged across a speeding ticket, a reportedly difficult moment in a draft room interview, things that, in the full context of NFL history, have never actually kept anyone from a roster spot. But then Cowherd does something genuinely sharp. He brings up Pete Rose, and I think he's onto something real with that parallel, whether he fully realizes it or not. Pete Rose was a full-grown adult in a position of enormous institutional authority, who broke federal law by gambling on his own team while managing it, while maintaining relationships with underground bookmakers and figures operating well outside the law. And for decades, a massive segment of the fan base campaigned for his Hall of Fame induction. People wrote columns defending him. His gambling got treated as a complicated footnote in an otherwise legendary career, not as a disqualifying verdict. Cowherd's point was that a college kid making a mistake shouldn't be held to a harsher standard than a grown man in a position of power who broke actual laws. And standing alone, that's a completely reasonable argument. That's actually a good point. The problem is what happens when you apply that logic selectively. If the framework is young people make mistakes and deserve room to grow and second chances and compassion, then that framework has to be applied evenly. Or it's not really a framework. It's a tool you pick up when it's useful and set down when it isn't. You cannot extend genuine warmth and patience to one young man's documented crisis while spending months treating another young man's speeding ticket as evidence of some deep, disqualifying character flaw. Those two things cannot occupy the same intellectual space without one of them being dishonest. Either the standard applies to everyone or it applies to no one. Pick a lane. That's not a radical ask. That is the most basic form of intellectual consistency imaginable. And I keep coming back to the question that I think is the most revealing one in this entire situation. If the circumstances were completely reversed, if it was Shedeur Sanders who had to step away from his program, who needed court intervention to restore his eligibility, who was dealing with a documented gambling issue serious enough to require professional help, would the coverage sound anything like what we've been watching? Would there be think pieces written with warmth and nuance about his private struggle? Would analysts be on national television describing it as something he's working through quietly? Would there be redemption narratives being constructed in real time, with this much patience built into the framing? You already know the answer. I know you know, because we all watched the actual coverage for months. It wouldn't be framed as a young man's private battle deserving of compassion. It would be framed as confirmation, as the proof everyone was already looking for. Every unnamed source, every vague front office whisper, every concerns about his makeup quote that never had a real name attached to it, all of it would have suddenly felt retroactively validated. That's not me being cynical. That's me describing exactly what the actual coverage pattern looked like across the last several months and extending it one hypothetical step forward. The uncomfortable part is how easy that extension is to make. And here's the final thing I want to leave you with, because it's the sharpest point in this entire conversation. Throughout Shedeur's pre-draft process, the cameras were on him constantly. His words, his expressions, his body language, his relationships, his background, his family, his father, his social media, his interviews. All of it under continuous, intense scrutiny for months. And across all of that, nobody produced a single piece of concrete, verifiable evidence of anything. Not one outlet, not one insider broke a story that held up. It was all speculation, all narrative, all vibes dressed up in analysis clothing. Every storyline was built from implication and anonymous quotes, not documented reality. Now compare that to a situation involving something real, something confirmed, something serious enough to require stepping away from competition and getting professional help. And the coverage surrounding it is gentler, more patient, more humanizing than anything that got extended to a player against whom nothing was ever actually proven. That's the part that should genuinely sit uncomfortably with you. And I say that not to score points or to tear anyone down. I say it because if that asymmetry doesn't bother you at least a little, I'd ask you to look at it again more carefully. Where does all of this leave us heading into the season? On one side, there's a quarterback doing the quiet, unglamorous, genuinely impressive work of stacking new tools onto an already real foundation, training at altitude, developing movement skills, earning praise from his own coaching staff for dimensions of his game that surprise them when they actually watch the tape. That player is trending upward, and he's doing it without asking for anyone's attention. On the other side, there's a media conversation that still hasn't fully reckoned with the inconsistency baked into how it handles character, mistakes, second chances, and the benefit of the doubt, depending on whose name is attached to the story. Until that inconsistency gets addressed honestly and directly, every "this kid deserves a fresh start" take is going to land a little hollow for anyone who remembers exactly how unforgiving that same conversation was just a few months ago, aimed at someone who never actually did anything close to what would have merited that level of scrutiny. Because this was never really a spreadsheet argument about who the better prospect is on paper. It's a question about whether we're being straight with ourselves about why some players get the benefit of the doubt built in from the start, while others get buried under speculation before they ever get a real shot. And until somebody gives that question a genuine, honest answer, not a deflection, not a pivot, not a reframe, this conversation is going to keep circling back around because the people watching it aren't going to forget what they saw.